So we're starting this morning on the first of 2 weeks with the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul and boats kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. That he spends a lot of time on a boat. And it's important to look at Paul because of where he lands things and because of what it is that he is doing. Jesus, with his disciples, stayed in a relatively small area, right? He was down around Jerusalem. He would go out to the Sea of Galilee. Sometimes they would go up to Capernaum. But mostly they stayed in a very small sort of area, and that was okay. Being on boats for them meant that they were fishing. It meant that Jesus was teaching. It meant that occasionally they were traveling. But they spent a lot of their time doing the other things. Now, Paul, on a boat, was meant for living that life out, for living out what it was that he'd been taught. His travels were wide-ranging all over the eastern part of the Mediterranean basin, all the way from Italy back over to Israel, and lots of points in between. Paul was in so many of those places. He had many different experiences. He met many different people that would have been, in some cases, kind of unfamiliar to a lot of the folks back in Jerusalem or some of the places they were there. Jesus intentionally focused on teaching his disciples because he knew what he was doing. He was preparing them to be the ones to go out, but they had to know what all this was first. And so he was teaching them and the others that would come to hear his lessons and to see his miracles. He was doing that. And so he stayed close to those places that were very familiar. Now, Paul, on the other hand, absorbed all of those teachings. Paul did it the hard way, though. Because about this time when Jesus would have been teaching and doing all of this, he probably would have been in school learning everything. And because he was a Pharisee, he would have been learning everything that Jesus was teaching and precisely why all of it was wrong. Because remember, Paul was not exactly one of Jesus' favorite people. He didn't like anything that Jesus taught. He thought he was completely flat and wrong all the time. But he had to know what all of that stuff was. Remember where it is the first time we see Paul in the New Testament. We don't hear anything about him until we get to the story of the stoning of Stephen. And there is where he was, when he was known as Saul, he was standing there literally holding the coats of the people who were throwing the stones. Like, I can see this in my mind. Paul is standing there. In one hand, he's got an armful of cloaks draped over one arm. In the other hand, he's got a basket full of stones. They come, they drop their coat off, they come and they grab a stone. This is where he was. That's what he was doing. And Paul was that guy. Hold on to that image for a moment of what that looked like. This is the same guy who would then go from there, and we start to see him become more active, but he starts running around all of that same territory, using all of this knowledge he had of what Jesus was teaching and what his followers were doing, so that he could go round them up, and he could arrest them, and he could bring them up on charges, and all of those things. Paul was a Pharisee's Pharisee. By his own admission, he was that. He was that guy when the other Pharisees had a question about what to do, they'd come to him. Or in other cases, he might be, all those good cop procedural dramas whenever the cop does something bad and they bring in the internal review guys that are always like the bad guys of the story. That was Paul. Like that was his role. He was that guy that would come in to do that. But something happens, and he becomes the guy that goes out and teaches. That is teaching all the people about who Jesus is and what was going on. And it worked because before he ever got to Damascus, he already knew everything that Jesus taught. Paul's trouble was that he thought it was all wrong. That not only was it all wrong, but it was all dangerous. Jesus' teachings were dangerous, and he knew it, and it was all wrong. Until he gets to that road to Damascus, he never had an experience with Jesus before. He gets to the road to Damascus, and there, and that light comes down on him, and he hears Jesus' voice for the first time. He's blinded by the experience, and And then it takes him time to kind of process what happened, because his whole world takes a big 180 that day. It goes from everything they're doing is wrong and it's dangerous to everything that Jesus said is right and it is still dangerous because of what it can do. And that's where Paul is. He figures out that Jesus was right because of that experience that he had with him. But then Paul was sent. He was sent to go to all of the places where Jesus had never gone. Look up on that map there where you see all those kind of lines running around every place. Those are Paul's journeys that he took all over that part of the world. And we pick our story up today in Acts chapter 20. Paul is on his third journey. And specifically, he is in kind of this part of the map on there. He's making his way down from Assos to Mytilene to Chios to Ephesus. He's kind of moving his way down south there a little bit. Now, it's important to know where he is on this journey because he is on the latter part of the journey. He's on his way back to Jerusalem. He's only got 4 journeys that he goes on, and this is the third one in like the last half of that third journey, and he knows that something is coming. He knows because he knows the people that are involved. He knows the danger of what he's been preaching and teaching. He knows all of the people that he has made upset because he was probably in school with a lot of them. And so he knows who they are and what they're thinking, and he knows what it means for him if he goes back to Jerusalem, that he knows that's where he has to go. And so he's making this stop in Ephesus. He's kind of making his way down. No big, huge boat voyages on this one, but he's starting to sail his way down the coast before he makes that last trip to Jerusalem. And he's stopping in Ephesus to meet with the elders so that he can tell them what's coming up, so he can get things in order. Now, in some ways, we look at what Paul is doing here, and I kind of look at him and say, Paul, you're being a little bit overly dramatic here. Take a look at, beyond our reading for this morning, verse 29. He's telling them, he says, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you and won't spare the flock. I mean, Paul, you're getting a little bit dramatic there, but Paul also is very careful with his words. Paul is one that he may use a lot of words to describe things, but he never has a word that is misplaced in any of that. And so he's actually not far off the point when he says this, that he knows what they're going to face when he is gone. What he's doing is making sure that they're set for what's going to come after this. And in fact, it's very similar in many ways to what we see Jesus doing in our story from last week. Remember how that story went where Jesus, where the disciples, this was after Jesus' resurrection. They knew that he was alive, that he had risen from the dead. They had seen him a couple of times, but they didn't know what was coming next. And so they're in that weird limbo space. So they hop onto a boat. They go fishing overnight because that's what they knew. So they went fishing. They didn't catch anything. The sun comes up in the morning. They see this dude standing on the beach, and he's like, hey, throw your nets to the other side of the boat and see what you catch. And they haul in this huge catch of fish. And then they figure out that it's Jesus standing there on the beach. They bring the boat in, and then Jesus makes them breakfast. Like apparently Jesus must have been a Methodist because everything is better with food. That is, but he does it because that's what they need. They needed to know that he was still there, that he was with them, and that he wasn't going to leave them on their own, because even though they knew probably somewhere in the back of their minds that Jesus wasn't always going to be physically with them, they needed to know that he was still there. They needed that reassurance and that comfort in that moment. So he feeds them. He gives them breakfast. Now granted, they were probably the ones that caught the fish, that he made it for them, and so that was, for them, that was what they needed so very badly. Now, Paul isn't Jesus, so he can't do the exact same thing with his folks that Jesus did with the disciples, but he did something very important for them still. And that is that he didn't sugarcoat anything. He didn't try and tell them that it was all going to be fine, that it was going to be okay, that yeah, maybe there's going to be a few bumps in the road, but you'll be okay. And have you ever had someone tell you that and you want to look back at them and go, those were some awful big bumps down there that you didn't quite prepare me for, right? Paul wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to sugarcoat that. He said, this is what's going to happen, and I know this is going to happen. And he told them what they were going to be facing, and he named it. He named it for them. And you've heard me say this before, but it's important to be reminded of this, that there is incredible power in naming things. In naming what it is, because when you can name it, then you can figure it out. When you can figure it out, you know how you can get through it. And they needed to hear that. They needed to know what that was going to be. Paul knows he can't provide for them like Jesus did for the disciples. But what he can do is he can name what's going to happen. And then, most importantly, he can tell them and remind them what they need to do in response. This is verse 24. But nothing, not even my life, is more important than completing my mission. This is nothing other than the ministry I received from the Lord Jesus to testify about the good news of God's grace. For Paul, his mission is most important. And that mission is to testify about the good news of God's grace. So let's put this together. I look at this verse out of here, and it feels kind of like an impossible standard that Paul is setting up, doesn't it? I mean, Paul is emphatic about that this is my mission, and my mission that I received from Jesus himself is to go and testify about the good news. And then we see everything Paul does. So like he carries even more weight than just the words that are up there with that, because it is such a big thing that Paul is doing. Paul is all in. He has dedicated his life to spreading the gospel. And the point for us here is not to miss the forest for the trees, because we have to remember what Paul is doing. First, he's giving them comfort that no matter what happens, that this is the life that he chose. That he knows what's going on with this, and he knows what's going to happen with this, and that this is the life that he wants. He knows the consequences of it, because he knows the opposition that he is facing, and so he's going into this all with eyes wide open. That this is him. He knows what's going to happen. But the second piece of this is that he isn't telling them to go and do just exactly like he did, because he knows that's not their calling. That their calling is a little bit different. Now, part of it is the same. The mission is still the same. To go and spread the gospel, that's still the main thing to do that. But what he doesn't tell them is go and do exactly as I did. But throughout this passage, throughout Acts chapter 20, we can see kind of the guidelines that he sets up for them and how to go about doing this. And so first let me go back to the right slide. First and foremost is to have faith. To remember always to go back where we are pointed to remember who we put our faith in. But that's the most important first step, because then we have to be able to stay alert. Because it's not a matter of if, but it's a matter of when things are going to go badly. It's not a matter of if, but a matter of when someone is going to come in and try and do something. There is Todd Bolsinger, who's out at Fuller Seminary. You've all have heard me quote him before. I may not have ever said his name, but I quote him a lot because he is a church leadership expert, teacher, and is doing a lot of things right. And one of the things that he says is that in churches and doing things that it's not a matter of if, but when the sabotage happens. That something is always going to happen that's going to make things hard, that's going to get in the way, that's going to disrupt and interrupt and try to tear apart whatever it is that we are doing. Not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And the other thing he says is that a lot of times it's done by folks who are good-hearted and well-meaning and well-intentioned, but just don't quite understand what's going on. So he would say the same thing that Paul does. Stay alert. Because it's going to come, it's going to happen. But when you know it's coming and it's happening, then you can be ready for it. So have faith, stay alert. And then Paul says, help the weak, help those that are in need, help the poor, help those that are less fortunate. Do those things. Because those are the folks that need it the most. Those are the folks that a lot of times are going to be most receptive to hearing. And it's not just, often we think of just the poor who were asking for change along the sides of the road in Jerusalem or Ephesus or Thessalonica or any of the other places that Paul was traveling. But Paul spent a lot of his journeys, when you hear him talk in his letters about collecting gifts to send back to Jerusalem. The church leadership was not very well off back then. They were doing as much as they could to spread the gospel, but oftentimes they were doing it on a shoestring budget. And so Paul was constantly raising resources to be able to send back to them so that they could do more in ministry. And so it's, help of the week takes on a huge, different way of thinking, because it's about helping those who are trying to be who God wants them to be. And finally, this isn't something he says, but we see it when we come to the end of chapter 20. This is about verses 36 to 38. We stay connected to each other. Because we see Paul's reaction and the reaction of the elders when he finishes speaking. They come together, they hug, they embrace, they are crying with each other, they're praying with each other, because they don't want to say goodbye. They know they have to, but they have grown incredibly close over this time. I look at Paul and I see someone who can communicate more and faster with a piece of parchment and something to write on that parchment than most of us can pulling out a cell phone and trying to call someone. Because literally, we go back to that map we were on, as Paul was leaving one part up there, he was sending messengers on ahead to Ephesus to make sure to gather the elders so that they could meet with him. And his network was incredibly fast and good. But we see what he did. Every time he would stop and he would start a church and he would bring people to Christ and they would begin to gather. There's a reason why we have so many of his letters, because he was always constantly writing back to them, encouraging them, supporting them, hearing their responses so he could help and he could support and he could do all of that. Paul stayed connected with his folks in ways that social media can't even seem to begin to compare to now, and he had to do all of that the hard way. But he stayed connected because that's what kept them all together. Now, how we do all of this, these are like the guidelines that kind of Paul is beginning to describe through all of this. But how we do this is up to that call that God has for each of us in our lives. That it's unique for each person and for each church and for each community of faith. But the thing to remember is that Paul had a rich and a full and a good life. He had a direction that he was going in his life. It didn't make his life any less or any more than anyone else's, but he knew who he was following, and he knew what that meant for his life. And because he knew that direction that he had, that purpose that he could live that life to the fullest in a way that others around him couldn't even really begin to understand. And that's what he is wanting for his people and what he wants for us. And how we get there is we do these things that Paul is describing. Oftentimes the Christian life is kind of presented in boring terms. Have you seen that like in read books or TV shows or movies or whatever, and you see Christians, and quite frankly, they always seem to be really boring. You've seen in movies, it's always whenever someone comes into trouble and they walk into the church, it doesn't matter if it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 2 o'clock in the morning. The pastor is always standing there putting hymnals or Bibles back into the pews so that he's there whenever someone walks in, right? I don't know about you, but it's very rare that I'm up here at 2 o'clock in the morning, especially restocking pews and the Bibles, mostly because either Mary Beth or Richard has beat me to it already, so I don't have any to do. And but we get this portrayal that's kind of a boring life. Because we've got this kind of mindset built up that comes out of the ascetic lifestyle, like monks or nuns or stuff like that, and it's like, that's not an exciting life, right? Paul had anything but a life like that. To live a Christian life doesn't mean it has to be boring, doesn't mean it has to be dull, doesn't mean that you have to be up here at the church at weird hours of the night just in case someone walks in through a locked door. But it means that we follow, that we have faith, that we know things are going to happen that are going to derail us, and we just know that's going to be a thing. And when we know that's going to be a thing, we can actually handle it a whole lot better than if it comes up and surprises us. And because we have a built-in community of faith connected to each other, we can live that life in a way that is better together than it is on our own. What makes all this possible is our focus on God. And being able to name that focus in the person of Jesus Christ gives us more power in our lives and helps us to live our lives the most and complete way that we can. So as we prepare to go from here today, this is our goal, is to know that focus and to have that focus, and every day to claim and to name that person that is our direction and our goal, to name Christ every day in our life and know his presence with us, and know that through him we can have life that we can't have in any other way. So I invite us, as we prepare to sing our last hymn this morning, to name his presence in our life and to live this life in Christ's name. Let us do all of this in his name. Amen.